First of all, thank you all for joining us today for our second kind of in-person Worldview event and launch of our Wave 5 research. So we're going to start today by sharing the latest research. Many of you will already be familiar with many of the questions, the segmentation as well, and really outlining where we see some of the changes in particular from last year to this year. And now I think really this year in particular we can really see some of the trends emerging since we started this Worldview research as well. We're then going to look at, and we're going to have a panel discussion after the presentations, and we'll be joined by a number of speakers today. So we have Katie Kirkwood from Ipsos Behaviour and Attitudes, who has been working on Worldview for the past several years, and she'll be presenting on some of the core research. We also have David Hudson from Development Engagement Labs, who some of you would have met before, who has been a strategic advisor to Worldview over the last number of years and comes with, I suppose, a lot of experience and knowledge about how Worldview fits via the other international research which is happening in this area. We have Neil Douglas from Behaviour and Attitudes also, who is Head of Qualitative Research. And Neil is going to speak to the imagery research that we conducted this year. So as some of you know, this year, in addition to the quantitative research we did, we also engaged in a number of questions and focus groups around imagery, where we debranded a number of our members' imagery to see what resonates or not with the Irish public. So we'll be talking about some of that research outcomes today. And finally, at the panel discussion, we'll be joined by Razan Ibrahim, who's a journalist and human rights activist and is specialising in content verification, misinformation and disinformation, and who will lend her experience to the panel discussion. So we'll start with the presentations, and please do take note of any questions that you have, because we really want this to be an engaging session where you'll also get to ask any questions during the panel discussion. So with that all in mind, I'll just hand over to Katie now, who will go through the findings of this year's research. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. So as Jan was saying, my name is Katie Kirkwood, and alongside Luke Reaper, I work on the quantitative research. So this is now the 5th iteration of that quantitative piece. So I suppose just to summarise, so basically every year we run one major kind of quantitative piece of research, and that is an online survey to over 2,500 people, and we run it once a year mostly, and I think in 2021 we ran it twice. So we have 5 different iterations of the research at this stage. And just to highlight as well, the interviewing is conducted through our online panel. So we have a panel of about 40,000 people from that we take, and we get their opinions from that. So I suppose just to start off with the segments. So I'm sure people are familiar with this across the different previous years, but I suppose just to highlight a couple of key things. So as you can see at the top, we have the more highly engaged individuals, global citizens. So I suppose realistically across all of these different segments, there's been minimal changes with the exception of, I suppose, the less engaged. So what we're seeing is there's a reduction in terms of empathisers of about 4%, and that basically is moving into the disengaged grouping, and that's now at 17%, increasing by 3% since 2023. And in terms of kind of general changes, I suppose what we're seeing is there's less differentiation between class. So especially say in the disengaged grouping, we're seeing less sort of working class than we saw in 2023. So it's just interesting to note that moving forward. And I suppose just in terms of the overseas development aid, I suppose when we're looking at, generally speaking, the entire sample of the 2,500 people, we're seeing that, I suppose, the levels of concern around poverty in developing countries, it's remaining high, but we are seeing that that's sort of stagnating, or in some ways declining, really. When we look at comparisons to the February 2021, we're seeing that we have a concern decrease of about 8 percentage points across that. And I suppose the main kind of driver would be the disengaged segment there. So what you're seeing is about 30% are saying that they are just not concerned at all about poverty in developing countries at this stage. And then moving on then to, I suppose, the importance of the Irish government providing overseas development aid. Again, we're seeing a slight stagnation here. So basically 73% of people agree that it's important the Irish government are providing overseas development aid at this stage. And then when we split that out by the segments, again, there's that clear differentiation amongst the disengaged segments. So only 23% of the disengaged believe that it is important that the Irish government are providing that overseas aid piece. And then this was moving on then to ODA basically bringing about positive change for those living in developing countries. And again, we are seeing that, I suppose, the flattening out and the levelling out of opinions here. So again, about 3 in 4 are saying that they agree that overseas development aid can help bring about positive change. And again, when we're looking at that segment piece, most segments are remaining relatively similar, with the exception of the disengaged again. Basically, 38% agree that overseas development aid can bring about that positive change for those living in developing countries. And just to, I suppose, put that into perspective, all other segments, the lowest that comes to is 80%. So you can see that wide differentiation there. And then I suppose when we move on to the main causes of poverty in developing countries, we're seeing quite a wide variety of responses here. But in saying that, the top three still remain the same. So government and private sector corruption in those countries is the number one, followed by war and conflict, and then government inefficiency or incompetence. But outside of that, you're seeing, not many people mentioning a legacy of colonialism, or high debt, or I suppose the area of exploitation as well from rich countries. There's, I suppose, lesser kind of mentions of those when we're considering the poverty in developing countries. So then moving on to the sources of news and information. So I suppose the main point from this slide, just to take into account, would be you can see over time there is, I suppose, less of a reliance on, say, TV. There's less of a reliance on radio, and we're seeing that increase in, say, the social media aspect and the podcasts as well. So realistically, what this is saying is that a multi-pronged communications approach is needed. Realistically, I suppose, to get across to all segments, a multi-channel approach will be needed. So, for example, in terms of your key segments, in terms of global citizens, they're relying on the likes of podcasts a little bit more, and that sort of area of social media. And I suppose the community champions are looking at more of a reliance on the kind of traditional media, so for example, radio and newspaper. And then I suppose just to highlight the insular sort of underlying atmosphere at the moment that I suppose growing. When we focus on the most important issues facing Ireland, the top three remain the same in house prices, health services and household bills. But I suppose if you look down at the fifth line there on immigration, what we've seen is since last year that has essentially doubled. So we're now at 29% that are citing that in the top three. And I suppose to just put into perspective, the year before that as well, it actually doubled again. So we're seeing a really major, significant increase in the mentions of immigration there. And I suppose as well, just to highlight that it's also an area of personal concern for many. So immigration is actually topping the list of personal concerns. And again, that is mostly led by the disengaged segments. So for example, that has jumped from when we focus on the area of issues facing Ireland. I suppose what we're seeing is that has increased among the disengaged grouping from 33% in 2023 to 48%. So half are now citing that in their top 3 issues for Ireland. So then just to highlight some key takeouts then. So number 1, concerns around poverty in developing countries and perceived importance of overseas development aid, they're stagnating, they're levelling out at this stage, with a little bit of a reduction, you could say, in some areas as well. And so this is paired with a continued lack of understanding surrounding poverty in developing countries and the role of overseas development aid in that. But I think it is important to highlight that when we're looking at, yes, there is stagnation, we are actually at quite a high rate of people believing that it is important still. So, you have 2 in 3 people saying that they are concerned about poverty in developing countries. And I suppose that does highlight just that kind of enduring history of giving and activism in Ireland. So not to lose sight of that it is actually at a very high level. And I suppose when we look at that kind of idea of the levelling out of opinions in terms of the overseas development aid, effective communications will be vital in that. And as I mentioned, that multi-pronged approach is really essential at this stage to make sure that we're covering all bases, especially among the community champions and the global citizens. And then finally, housing, health and household bills, they're remaining as the top 3 issues facing Ireland, but that immigration piece is really looming. And again, that just hints to an increasingly insular society, and that is, I suppose, where overseas development aid is sort of situated at this stage, and I suppose that kind of highlights those challenges. And obviously, notwithstanding itself, I suppose that the area of housing and especially household bills will obviously impact as well in many senses, because people have less disposable income at this stage to give. So I suppose when you put it into that sort of atmosphere, it's I suppose just to highlight that as well. Now, so just handing over to David.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name's David Hudson. I'm an academic and a researcher based at the University of Birmingham, and have been doing work in or around public opinion and development aid for quite some years now. What I wanted to present on was the quantitative side of the images research that we did, and to show you how the public responds, both in terms of trying to find out more information, but also emotionally to different images. And this is one of the images that was in the group. It shows a women's bicycle race in Burkina Faso, celebrating the 8th of March, International Women's Day. Okay, so first of all, I'll tell you a little bit about how we did the research. So we had 71 images overall, and I will show you them shortly. And of the respondents that Katie was talking about, it was at the end of the survey, it was an experiment where we showed them 5 of the images at random. And so each image was shown over 170 times, and then people were asked about their emotional response and then whether they wanted to find out more information. I'll show you those questions that we asked them here so you can see the exact question wording. The emotional responses come from a long literature in psychology that breaks down emotions into a circumplex. So you have positive and negative emotional responses, but then you also have activated and deactivated emotional responses. So what you're looking at here is happy and excited, obviously positive and activated. Then you've got positive, deactivated. Then you've got negative, deactivated. And then you've got negative activated, right? So people can score themselves on a 1 to 5 scale when asked on each one of these, looking at the photo. Then we asked them, imagine you see this photo as part of an appeal. Would you like to find out more information about it? Yes, they do, or no, they don't. Right, so that's the setup. Very helpfully, Katie explained the segments, so I can skip through this. which is great for me. So let's show you some of the images that were submitted from Dóchas partners and the research team. So as you can see, they've all been had their branding taken off, and there's a real range of different kind of images here. Some of them are in Ireland and showing supporters or activists, volunteers, and many of them are obviously overseas in what we think traditionally as developing countries. Some of them are single people, some of them show a crowd, some of them are close-up. Then you can see there's different kind of emotional registers here as well. So number 8 here, not looking at the camera, but very content. Number 5, looking straight down the lens, but very passive, neutral to negative maybe. So there's lots of things that will make people feel and think different things as we showed them the images. So I'm not going to go through them all, but it gives you a sense of the range and variety looking at these. And of course the full slide deck will be made very available after this, so you can have a look through both at the images but also how people responded to them. And I have to say, when you do this kind of work, it's super interesting because you have all of these kind of unspoken hypotheses about which images are going to do well and which aren't going to do so well, and don't always get it right, I have to say. I really like number 34 there. I had high hopes. Didn't do so well. Okay, and then getting on to 71. So that shows you all of the images there. And I'll point out number 66 here. You can see the girl standing in a street that's clearly been affected by probably conflict, and we will come back to that one. So, how did respondents respond to these images? Well, on average, right, so this is just taking them all together, about half of the time, 53% of the time, when shown an image, the people in the survey, the respondents said that they would like to find out more, right? So there's a relatively high level of self-reported interest in finding out more, which I think I took to be a very positive result. But what you see here, and this again echoes what Katie was talking about, is that you've got the disengaged group, and only 1 in 5 times do they want to find out more. They truly live up to their name, right? They are disengaged. They're not really supporters. But as soon as you get to the empathisers, then you can see that we're almost at that 50% threshold. And then you get a big jump with the community champions and the global citizens. But it is the community champions and not the global citizens who are most likely to want to find out more. If we could, and we could look at those people in the disengaged that used to be empathisers maybe, we would probably find they are more likely to be in that 20%. That would be my suggestion. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that you'll want to go away and have a look at and pore over, especially if you're one of the organisations that's put one of the images in, to see how your images were, how they performed. And you can see here that number 66, that image that I pointed out of the girl standing in the street, is the one that was most likely to elicit people wanting to find out more information, right? That was selected 68% of the time. So you can see that really performed so much better than when you go all the way to the other end, the bottom one there, only 28% of the time. So images and the images that we use really do matter. Right? It's not like this kind of this general response. We get quite a high variation, and if you get using the right image, then you can really get people's attention and wanting to find out more. Okay. So now onto the emotional response, because there's been lots of work, and I'm sure all of you in your organisations know this already, but actually so much of this is not a cognitive area. Where the public comes into it thinking of it on the basis of knowledge, etc. It is quite a values-driven and emotional part of people's behaviour. Right, so again, for all of the images here, what we've done is, quote-unquote, create a little emotional footprint. So those 4 different types of emotions, or 4 different areas of emotions, segments, you can see that there's that if they say a great deal, then they're higher up, and not at all further down. And if you look at them, there's clearly three kind of broad kind of responses here to the different images. First of all, you have ones where there's just basically no real response. It's quite flat, so you can look at maybe 22 here. It's kind of not much response, not much positive, not much negative, not much activated, not much deactivated. Secondly, we have the ones that have a very high negative and a very low positive response. So they're often the more traumatic or difficult images that people are looking at. And then there's the high positive and no negative ones. So the ones perhaps of smiling children, families, playing, those kind of things that people respond well to. Okay, so how does all this matter? Now we've kind of mapped it out. Well, when we put all of the different key variables that we have into a model, sorry about this if you don't like this kind of thing, there is the next slide which is just words, so I'll come on to that in a minute. But basically everything to the right of that black line, so there's three models here where we just build stepwise. We start off by just adding in the socio-demographics, then we add in the segments, and then we add in the emotional response of people to see how kind of stable these results are. So everything to the right of the black line, the vertical line, is showing that there's a positive effect of this particular variable, and everything to the left of the line is a negative effect. If it's grey, it's not statistically significant, so you can ignore it. The scale at the bottom, which shows like going up to 0.2 on that first one, that can literally be interpreted as probability. So if it's on 0.2, that would be an increase of 20%. All right, so that's the statistics lesson over. But what we can see here then is that being female, probably about a 5% more likely to want to seek information. Generation Z are similar, more likely to seek information. Though as we go along to the far right, you can see with emotions that actually that effect disappears once we add in those emotional responses. Just to pick out some key things here, I think again this confirms that the disengaged segment, like you're not going to get at them, and that is a slight worry given that seems to be increasing. So there's some kind of advocacy and strategic thought that needs to be given to that. But images probably isn't the way to go. That's one thing to say. In terms of then these bottom four here on the far right, happy, calm, sad, upset, the four kind of sections, what we see then is that if people report that they felt happy, positive and activated, seeing an image, then they become 7% more likely to want to find out more information. If people said that they felt upset, so negatively activated, they're 9% more. Those two are almost indistinguishable from each other. And if people said they felt calm, then they had a 2% more likelihood of wanting to find out more information. And if you make people feel sad, then they actually become less likely. So there's a very simple lesson there. Don't make people feel sad, okay? But you can upset them. So that's the summary of what I was just talking through. And so just to wrap up now, so what's the kind of key takeaways from this? Well, one, I think this is really important, and we found this in other research as well, that there are multiple ways to increase engagement. You can go through this positive activated pathway, but you can also go through a negative activated pathway. There might be unintended consequences of doing so though, so bear that in mind. We have found in other research that if you try and press that negative button too much, you actually depress people's sense of progress and hope. So that would be a warning there. Top images nearly always involve children, though crisis and need are also key there. In terms of the segments, we did this qualitatively and looked at kind of how they were responding, and these were our summary of this. That actually it varied quite a bit between the segments, which again I think is really useful and interesting when you're thinking about engaging with your audience. The empathizers were classically motivated by children in crisis and distress. Okay, so a very kind of traditional approach. Pragmatists, as their name suggests, very much liked targeted action. Multilateralists, it really, really varied. Community champions also responded to distress and need, but global citizens were much more likely to respond to the positive, everyday images of kind of real life. The way that I'm sure most people in this room would much prefer to represent the people that you work with. So again, I think there's a little bit of a challenge there of thinking about where the public is at and where we're at as well, and what we feel comfortable both ethically and normatively doing about that. Okay, as I said, don't make people feel sad. And those are classic images that scored very highly on people saying that they felt tired, bored, depressed, sad, negatively deactivated. Final thing I want to say before I finish. We could also use the results to create the perfect or the most likely image to be selected. And what it would look like, and this is where I'm so happy that I'm a researcher and not a creative person. The optimal emotional response is somebody that scores 5 on happiness, 5 on calmness, 1 on sadness, and 5 on upset. How do you do that? I have no idea. But if you can do that, then there would be a 92% probability of that person finding out more. So there's a creative challenge. One thing I do think is these are all static images, obviously. Perhaps you could do that through something that's more like a video or a movie. You could take people on a journey maybe and create that. That's the closest I've come. But thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, David. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. I'm Neil Douglas from Ipsos BNA, and I was responsible for the qualitative phase of our project looking at the imagery. What I'd like to do is just to give you a little bit of background about what we're doing this year, because it's a more substantial piece of qualitative than we've done for Dóchas in the past. So what we were setting out to do with the project was to understand, first of all, a contextual piece. What are the kind of issues that are important to people at the moment? What are they talking about? What provokes a desire to respond in a kind of a general way? But our main focus was then looking at selected images from David's work. We were able to identify a short list of the more upsetting or the more positively stimulating imagery, and also some that were more effective with different segments. So those were selected to put into this stage of the project. So we had 25 images that we were looking at within the qualitative work. The project was based on 6 face-to-face group discussions conducted across the country. These are interactive sessions where everyone has the opportunity to speak their mind in their own words, and where we encourage them to do so. So there's a warm-up stage, and then we get into the prompted stage of discussion, where we showed them the imagery and asked them to code their reactions. We represented most of the segments: 2 empathizers, 1 global citizens, 1 multilateralist, 1 pragmatist, 1 disengaged. We excluded community champions because they were considered to be similar to global citizens in this stage. The last thing that we did before people came along to the session is we wanted them to think about or warm up a little bit before they attended. So we asked them to complete a pre-task, thinking about issues that made them feel hopeless, they didn't feel that they could do anything, and issues that galvanized them into action. So they prepared in a way for what we're going to be doing. With David's help, we also identified the circumplex model as something we used to stimulate and help structure how people responded to the images. So we showed them the model, we explained how it worked, and we left this up available for them to reference as they looked at the images. That gave them a vocabulary, a reference point for expressing their feedback. Each time they saw a new image, we asked them to note down their spontaneous thoughts individually, not talking to each other. This allowed us to capture what we refer to as System 1, the gut reaction, just your intuitive kind of reaction. And then in discussion, we got a much more detailed review of what they were saying and thinking, or System 2, in terms of their feedback. From this work and the 25 images that we reviewed, we were able to identify consistent issues that seem to activate each time people look at images. So we can talk about the factors that influence their reaction to images. And I'm going to go through each of these in more detail, but just to give you a heads up, here are the ones that we identified. Impact, the immediate reaction, how does this stand out? The meaning for the protagonist. Many of the more effective images have a prominent protagonist. What's the meaning of that and how do they interpret that? What's the connection they feel, the viewer connection, and how strong a connection do they feel? The storytelling power, or the layers of meaning that they can interpret and be rewarded as they look at the image for longer. The authenticity of the scenario. Does this look like something that is true? Do I believe it? Does it ring true? And lastly, just simply the quality of the photo. Is it a good picture? Is it well shot? Is it in focus? And so on. So what happens is each variable influences responses, and a strong or weak performance on any of them tends to move the dial. And obviously if you're scoring highly on lots of them, you have a particularly effective image. One of the most effective images identified by David's work, and indeed in our work, qualitatively in the group discussions, is this one, image 66, with the individual girl seen on her own. This has very strong impact. And looking at why they reacted to this impact, it's because of the immediacy of the image. It draws attention, and it gets lots of different reactions evolving as people are drawn in. To a certain extent, we have to think about the context here. We're exposed to a great variety of imagery and video content all day, every day, and we're quite adept at screening things out. So you need to cut through, you need impact to get past that. And typically when we look at impact, it seems to be made up of a sense of drama. Something is happening that is interesting and dramatic, or there's a sense of novelty, something I haven't seen before. So the question is, will this image stand out from other images? That's a key question. That's what generates impact. And does it portray something new? And this image effectively did both. Meaning for the protagonist. A lot of these images that were selected in our shortlist draw attention to an individual. And really what you're thinking about here is the juxtaposition of the individual with others in the frame or within the context. And what does that say? Reactions are largely influenced by either or both of these. And in this particular image that I've got on screen, number 68, it displays all of these kind of key issues. You see for the protagonist a sense of vulnerability, jeopardy, and you also see their emotional state. The expression on the young child is very visible as being very upset. That's a key driver of that protagonist meaning. The individual is isolated. It's not close up. We are invited to look at the isolation of the individual. This portrays very clearly a sense of vulnerability and jeopardy. If you look closely, as many did, you can see that the child has only one shoe. And there's a sense that this is a child that's in jeopardy. So it evokes, particularly amongst parents, a very strong reaction generated by this protagonist meaning. Viewer connection. It's clear that some images just connect more strongly than others. And we see this in other projects. It's where someone, stimulated by material that we're showing them, reacts spontaneously and intuitively before they know it. Rather than talking about the image, they're talking about their own lives. They're referring back to how they process the information based on their own experience. And that's a really clear sign of that connection, that relatability that they're feeling. Now, relatability is most obvious when it's that intuitive gut reaction. But it can also happen over time. As someone looks at an image that they're engaged with and they begin to process it, they may find deeper connections, and you have this depth charge reaction. So after a couple of minutes, suddenly there are 3 people in the group who are going, oh my God, this makes me think about X, Y, and Z. So there's relatability can be immediate and gut, or it can come over time. But in either option, it's about that connection we feel. Storytelling power. As people talked about their reactions, it was evident that the images unfold with layers. They create a story. They talk about what they're seeing in the context of the background that they're interpreting. And really this is about expressing with clarity And that can have more effect if we express that background, or if it engages in a way with wider stories, a contemporary sense of this is what's happening in the world today, a particular issue. This child, this girl in the street, for example, earlier on, that must be Gaza. I imagine that's something, there's been a bombing, there's been an event. They immediately started talking about the story. And why is she looking calm? Has she lost someone? So they're involved in the story, they create the story. And with this particular image, 13, is a great example of the storytelling. What's the relationship between the farmer and the cattle? He looks like he's treating it like a pet. That's a very close relationship. They engage with the story. They want to understand it more. Authenticity. One of the most important aspects of how people process any information is whether they take it as coming from a reality or if it's concocted. And that comes through very clearly with imagery. And again, we're living in a world of social media where images may be airbrushed or AI generated. So we're adept at spotting what we think of as real or less real. And in this case, what you're looking at is an image which is very candid. You can't interpret this as something that's been staged, because as you look around the faces of the children, you can see some that are very up and positive and others that are completely clueless. They don't even know they're being photographed. Now that doesn't happen if it's completely staged. You would choose the photo with all of the eyes towards the camera. So that evokes a sense of being an authentic image. And people start talking about, oh yeah, my kids are kind of that age and they do this. And again, you get past this filter of is it real, is it not, immediately, because it rings true. So what we're looking for, I suppose, is also something that is authentic and has a sense of recency, ideally, because we're dealing with an audience that is largely trained by social media and AI. There is also just simply, is it a good photo? And that can be the obvious, is it in focus? Can I see what I'm supposed to look at? But actually, if you think about it, there's some images, even in the set, that perform well, that the contrast is poor. We saw the image a moment ago, 66, with a young child, a little boy, beside a puddle. Now actually it's very low contrast. The image of the individual does not stand out from the background very well, so it doesn't necessarily score well as a quality photo. Whereas the image that's on screen at the moment is in focus. We get a clear story, it's got symbolic kind of meaning, and we've also got eye contact with the child, as well as strong colour in the hat. So you're getting a number of features that amp up the quality of the response because it's a really good quality photo. So what can we do with these key factors, and where does this lead? I think we need to think about what provokes people to support international aid, and clearly linking emotion to a bigger issue can help, but big issues, as David talked about in relation to eliciting a sense of sadness, if those bigger issues don't connect with agency, people can feel a sense of hopelessness rather than I can do something in response. But there are both positive and negative emotions that can trigger a response. With the negative route, emotional connection to the protagonist, particularly a child, and their experience can be a really important vector for their interaction. Ideally, there needs to be a clear sense of a way to help with the predicament, to avoid that sense of hopelessness. And then linking the problem to a bigger issue can help to nail a sense of injustice or even anger about the issue, and therefore something galvanizing you want to do something about it. Positive emotion triggers, evidence of a positive impact before and after can be effective, but this needs to be paired with a sense of concrete and proportionate positivity so that you can diffuse concerns about my action will be lost or it won't get to the end recipient. And linking that to a bigger story can help to communicate things about resilience, a sense of hope about that, and so on. So both negative and emotional triggers can lead us a different pathway, but each of them, to an extent, need to have some sense of agency for the viewer. What are the elements that inhibit a desire to respond? I think, as we saw, authenticity is a key vector, but if it looks staged or inauthentic, that can be just a barrier straight away. I don't believe this is true. One of the images we looked at, when carefully examined, you could see to this far left-hand side a camera, another camera, not the one shooting the photograph. So when people spotted that, they went, oh, come on, this is just a series of journalists set up to take this shot. It isn't real. And immediately the scales fall away from people's eyes and they disregard the image because it's inauthentic. If there's no problem to resolve, And this is a real problem for ourselves, because we don't want to present just people who are vulnerable. But actually, if there isn't a problem or a need being expressed, if people seem happy, healthy, affluent, the danger is people can come back and feel, what is my role here? What am I supposed to do? Now that is, as you'd expect, most evident with the disengaged, but we saw evidence of it across the board, across the segments as well. So there needs to be a clear way to make a difference, and if they don't see a clear way to make a difference, or there's a danger that they feel their involvement will be lost, they may disengage. So something about the image doesn't ring true, the viewer can see no way to help. When we looked at all 25 images, we were able to map these against the circumplex model, and while it's a lot to take in one go, the colour coding represents the different sets. The red set were the emotionally upsetting images, the gold set were the happy, positive eliciting images, and then the green and the blue were ones that worked better for specific segments or failed to work at all. If you glance at the red dots, you can see that, as you'd expect, they're disproportionately represented on the left-hand side of the unpleasant side of the chart, and quite a lot of them are in the higher energy, but actually we did find some that were low energy positives, even amongst this upsetting set. The gold set is more effectively on the positive side of the map, but there's also both higher and lower energy in terms of the way they activate. In our full analysis, we paired this feedback with a breakdown of those key factors that we talked through. So each image is given its kind of grading both on this emotional agenda and also those key factors. So what can we conclude from this? How can we take this forward? I've got a couple of thoughts for our review of images. Effective images from this set of 25 that we looked at, in almost every instance, have direct eye contact. We exchange roles with the protagonist. It's almost impossible not to do that. We're primed as primates to do that. Immediate sense of need or vulnerability for the protagonist. The protagonist's story is powerful, it's potent, they need me. The clarity to the story itself. But not just a simple story, not a story that just ends at one level. Ideally, it's got layers. And the girl standing on her own in a city gives that sense there's layers, there's depth, there's more to get from this. Connection to a contemporary narrative can also be potent. This is a story that relates to something I know about world news I'm already engaged in. And then lastly, is there a role for me as a viewer? Is there a need for my response? What am I in relation to this? You've made me feel something. Now what do I do with that feeling? Is the key question. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Neil. And I think you'll all agree that there's a lot to unpack really with this research, quite a lot to think about. And I do think that it is remarkable that this is the first time, I think, for the sector that we've ever had this level of evidence around imagery and what works and what doesn't. And I think there is a lot that we need to think about also in terms of how this relates back to our own ethical guide on communications and how we want to communicate, the stories of those who we assist, who we support, who we work with in a way that is respectful and with dignity, but also in a way that really engages people here in Ireland and builds that level of engagement, that support amongst the public. So I'd like to invite our panellists now to join us here on stage, and we'll start a short question and answer. So we have Razeen Ibrahim, if you'd like to join us, Neil and David as well here up on stage, and we'll start a panel discussion now. All used to my voice, so you can hear me fine. I think really just to start, and Razan, I'll start with you because I know you've done a huge amount of work around content verification, combating misinformation, disinformation over the last 10 years. And can you talk a little bit about your experience and how this area has changed or evolved over the last few years as well?
Yeah, I like resin, by the way, so yeah, beautiful. So yeah, absolutely. I started working on verification, authenticating content on social media in particular since 2015 when I joined the Storyful news agency, and it was one of the first, not one, it was the first social media news agency in the world. And the idea of that emerged from war zone areas where newsrooms wanted content as soon as possible, but they wanted authenticated, verified and real content, because many of them, they fell into the trap of promoting videos from, I remember the story was supposed to be from Syria. They did promote on their platform and on the TV, like a lot of prominent and news agencies and TV with high reputation. They did posted videos from Iraq, for example, like 10 years old videos, or videos from Yemen, but they said to be, it is from Syria. So that's the idea, and I joined the verification team in 2015. My main work and focus was war zone areas, Syria, Yemen. I did work on Palestinian as well content, refugee crisis in 2015 and on. So really important because it's conflict and it has also angle of human rights, and that was a responsibility. Started with verifying videos, mainly verifying 3 aspects of video or any content, I'd say. The source, where did it come from? What's the account? Do they have agenda or they don't have agenda? Are they citizen or they are journalists, etc.? Then the location of the video, and what I used to do is to match what I am seeing in the video or in the photo to Google Maps, or if I can identify any street name, sometimes accents would help me identify what area I am looking at. And then eventually the date, and the date is, I think, one of the most important aspects, because you need to prove when was that posted, and that is as well a very important one. So anyway, that was like mainly our work at that time, but then 2020, COVID hit. And I have to say, the whole idea of disinformation, even hate speech, shifted to an era we've never seen before. People were isolated in lockdowns. Some of them really fell into what we call rabbit hole of content after content, videos after videos, and they kind of started to reorg. So all what we have seen before, they were in one pot during COVID. And since COVID on, we see a lot of conspiracy theory. Like one of the biggest conspiracy theory we are seeing currently is the Great Replacement, which is a far-right conspiracy theory. Started 2011, and it was in a book by a French writer. 2011, and now after COVID, it became one of the mainstream far-right conspiracy theory in public. So what we have seen is it is now more organized, like very focused groups, I'd say. The propaganda, this is a big aspect, like Russian invasion of Ukraine, we're seeing huge propaganda on the social media, and they were inauthentic, organized campaigns that make the audience feel, oh, this is real, this is what the public opinion is about. But it was inauthentic, fake accounts, spreading unprecedented amount of account on social media. And I have to say the biggest change and the challenge now for journalists AI generated content, as well you were mentioning before. This is absolutely the biggest challenge we are facing. It is becoming so sophisticated, so well done, that I myself sometimes fell into this trap, and I believed one story or one video or even a photo, etc. So it is becoming so sophisticated and so fast that even to authenticate, it's a challenge. And I think in the future, we will become really hard to know what is happening, or if this is authentic or not authentic, because of how the system and the tools are becoming more sophisticated.
Thanks very much for that. I think it's really useful insight, I think, to put all of this into context, I think, and really bring kind of the environment, I think, that we're all working in, and trying to see how we can actually bring that level of authenticity to the public and through the media. I might go to you next, David. Just obviously you've done similar research than this in the US, Germany, France and the UK. So are you seeing similar trends emerging? Are you seeing kind of the impact of misinformation, disinformation, and how is that also affecting kind of the imagery side of things from your work over the last years?
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with everything you said, and it's quite depressing. It's a real challenge, but yeah, we've been doing very similar work in the 4 countries, and I think the country that probably offers the greatest lesson and warning is Germany. So for many years we used to go over to Germany and present our research. I was talking before to Karen about this, and they were all very polite and said, "This is fascinating, really interesting, but we're fine." And then about a year and a bit ago, we went over, and support for development assistance, development cooperation, had tanked, and it was actually below the UK for the first time ever. And all of a sudden they were very interested. And I remember one person said, "Oh, you've come from the future," as in everything that's happened in the UK with the end of DFID and the aid cuts, they were starting to see now. And it was all presaged by exactly what you were talking about, by all of the conspiracy theories online, about Bill Gates, about vaccinations, about 5G. And because we're funded by the Gates Foundation, they shared some social media research they'd done. And all of these conspiracies was spread through accounts that were associated with QAnon. So all of these conspiracies are very well organised on the far right, particular accounts, and that's now leaked into politics in Germany. We see the rise of AfD and dissatisfaction. What does this mean for the development community? I think, and I'm not sure how popular this is going to be, I think one of the biggest mistakes that was made by the development sector was, and I'll use the language very crudely, but banging on about 0.7, right? The public does not want to hear how much money we're spending overseas, and once they do hear it, it bothers them. What they are and do want to hear is about the good work that is happening, about the difference it's making. So to circle back to the question about images, they can be very powerful because they can show, as long as they're authentic, they can show the difference that your work makes. And I know Ireland is unusual, right? You're one of the only countries at the moment increasing the aid budget. Just carry on doing the good work. And so in the UK, we had so many discussions about 0.7 as though that was a really admirable thing to do. The public is not like you and us. So I think we have to think about messaging slightly different. I'll finish there.
Thanks very much, David. I'll just come to you, Neil, and then I might open the floor to questions and answers then. So you've worked extensively on this imagery piece of research and conducting all the 6 focus groups. Can you talk a bit about what trends came out of the discussions? Like, are we seeing long-term change in terms of how news is evaluated?
Thanks. Yeah, I think so. It's something we saw in this research, but in other projects as well. I think traditionally we would think about news and source of information as something that comes from an official source, journalistically verified, balanced reporting, fact-checked. But from the groups and from other work, it's clear that it's not the only source of information people are turning to or validating the same way. So not only is there more sources of information, there's different ways of evaluating the information. So certainly a source like RT News is about verification. It's news as verified, I guess. Truth as verified, perhaps. But there is a sense that there might be a hidden bias, and there's also a feeling maybe it's not as immediate. So you've got content that comes from platforms such as YouTube. So that's not just a crew filming the protest, it's from a protester or someone observing the protest and posting their feed. And what you then have is that sense of the truth is immediate. It's real because it's in the moment. It's before RT News can get it up. It isn't necessarily verified, but it also feels less biased, or the hidden bias is not in question somehow, but can't be trusted. And I think there's an emergent third type of information we could group under probably TikTok, because it doesn't work in the same way. It's not about something that's immediately produced. It's not something that's necessarily verified. It's something that feels true because it's from someone like me. So actually truth is relatable, is the TikTok model. So truth is verified, truth is immediate, truth is relatable. I think there are 3 different versions simultaneously, and someone may flip between each one. I think there's some that are growing, some that are more static. It's unfortunate perhaps to see that RT News maybe isn't the one that's necessarily in growth, although during COVID and lockdown it had an amazing resurgence because you needed truth to be verified at that time. So three versions of news and versions of truth perhaps.
Thanks. So I'd like to go to the floor. Any questions or comments from the audience here today? I know a lot to think about and consider. I think for our sector, particularly how things are changing, I think at quite a rapid pace, to be honest. So any questions from the floor?
Thanks to everyone, that was really interesting. This one is for David, very interested in what you had to say about the public and the 7%. And you said that when people did find out about how much we were giving, they were surprised. I take it you mean they were surprised in a negative way? They were like, oh my God, that's way too much money? Or could you clarify and maybe expand a bit? Thank you.
Absolutely. So in the I'm speaking mainly about the UK because it's the case I know the best. The 0.7 target was front and centre of a lot of the government's and the sector's communication. That I think is a mistake, because don't lead with this is how much we're spending, or we've spent 600 million on getting girls into education in Pakistan. Like, that's great, but that's not what works with the public. The irony is that the public always think that we spend way more than we do on ODA, right? But when you tell them that it's actually much less, and it's less than 1% of the government's budget, guess what? People still want to cut it, right? But then that's true for all sectors. Almost everything, people will want to spend less money. So just get away from money, I think, is the main thing that I'm trying to get across.
Thanks so much, Susan Murphy from Trinity College and Development Studies Association Ireland. The research is absolutely fascinating. Congratulations on really, really interesting and I think important contribution. My question is really just to hear a little bit more, if I can. I was fascinated by the research results which indicated that Gen Z is more engaged and more committed than millennials and others. And again, that's the generation that is TikTok, YouTube, that will be surrounded by false information, misinformation and so on. So I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit more insight on that, because I think that to me was perhaps some of the most optimistic outcomes from the results. Thanks.
Sure. I think the generational analysis is very interesting, I agree. One thing about generational analysis to keep in mind, I suppose, is that there's considerable overlap between generations. So Gen Z and millennials, many of them were at school together, experienced the same things in similar ways. So it's an artifact of where we decided to draw a line, more so than anything else that demonstrates a difference. But I do think for Gen Z, there is a sense of being part of the dialogue, being part of a narrative, where they have more agency, more sense of expressing issues and wanting to at least pay lip service to them. But when we look at engagement with issues and contribution, what we can see is that that isn't necessarily carried through. So it's much more likely that their behaviour in terms of showing up and doing something may lack agency in terms of actual performance when you compare to other generations. So I think there is definitely an interesting difference between millennials and Gen Z on that analysis, I agree. But I think it's who shows up and what they do in terms of the actions is the bit to look at, because with Gen Z it's particularly weak on a number of measures in other work as well as the study we looked at. Yes, sorry, please.
Yeah, just this is an observation, but I will definitely see this is a new era. We have to acknowledge, we have to know that it's an era of social media, and also I don't know, honestly, any Gen Z or any younger generation person, including relatives, they go to CNN to get news, or they go to RTE, with all my respect, or New York Times, etc. They only go to social media, and they find social media unfiltered news. And like you would see on TikTok, somebody like 20 years old, they have reach and they have viewers more than any report made by CNN, for example. So there is a huge now, like as I say, like the source of information, it is coming now for a younger generation. It's the social media, and I have to say they are. I'm so admiration for the younger generation, confident. They aren't afraid of the camera. They go and speak and etc. However, with the terms of our like the authenticity of the information, no social media platform or anyone can control that. And that is where we need to create a new way of understanding the news, analyzing the news, be critical, etc. So yeah, it is. I don't think we can control it, and they are just really going their way. And as I said, I'm learning from them personally. What we need to do is we have to speak their language, understand this generation, and be close to them, apart from be away and yeah. But yeah, that's just a general observation on that. Thank you.
Hello, hi, Mona from South Africa. My question is for Razan and maybe Neil as well. I felt there's a bit of juxtaposition maybe between the idea of imagery and news being authentic, but then the growing concern of AI, because especially recently, and Gen Z and the generation now are following social media. They do really care about, things being authentic, even if the quality is not the best. It's still what grabs attention most. But then there is a growing concern about AI and what that is going to do. But at least today, the way I would personally see AI is that you can still tell, like, the images are very much too perfect to be something that grabs people's attention. But what do you think is going to happen? And is AI going to now generate realer images? What's your opinion about that? And as our field, do you think that we should kind of maybe stay away from AI, or how do we utilize it? maybe this is a question for another session, but yeah, just like a quick your opinion about it.
Thank you very much. No, I say definitely we still can identify AI content, and by close look to any photo or any video, you can identify, and actually one of the first things I would go right now and look are hands and fingers. AI till today, they can't perfect these, like the eye and hands and fingers. When it comes to videos as well, we can still see mismatch between the lips and what has been spoken. And hands movement, blink is another big one that we can straight away identify. But I remember myself, one of the first photos I saw, and it was the Pope wearing the white, remember? I literally was like, wow. For a second, fraction of a second, I was like, what he's doing? I thought this is true. As I said, that it's going to be more sophisticated, more difficult to identify, and honestly, I don't think it will stop. On the contrary, it will go more and more. This is what we are seeing currently. What we need, although I am somebody with not in favor of over-regulating or over-regulations, but in this part of the work, you need regulations. And the AI companies who are producing this kind of content, they have responsibility. There should be disclaimer that no one can post it without disclaimer. But is this happening? Is there pressure on that? This is kind of more political question that we need to see more pressure on the AI companies themselves, social media as well, to label such content as AI. But yeah, it is going, and one of the things that we are currently seeing, because of the flood of AI and inauthentic images, we are seeing people now doubting even real images. So even if you present a real, authentic image, powerful, that will tell a powerful story as well, you will find people, oh no, this is AI generated, which is a real issue. So honestly, after all, it's education, education, education. That we need to keep telling that. We need to keep speaking about that, talking to people, younger generations, schools, etc. So I think that is an important part of what we do.
Thanks. I have a question actually just for Neil and for David, right? Because a part of the session we want to look kind of reaching new audiences in this era of a lot of AI, misinformation, disinformation, the social media changes. What did you see in terms of within the research of what would you say are the segments where you really think here in Ireland we should be focusing on, where there is that potential to really up the level of engagement with different audiences? Where did you see the most appetite for that within both the focus groups, but also in analysing some of the quantitative data?
Well, so just on the groups, I think we structured the groups by segments so we could identify where there were differences in feedback. And I think within each group there were some that were more articulate, that were slightly different from each other. So we tend to think of segments as all being the same, but there's slight variations. But certainly with the empathizers, they engaged in an emotional way more rapidly and more directly, exchanging roles with the protagonist, identifying on a level of relatability, which we saw in other groups, but was much more articulate and in evidence. So from what Katie was reporting as a drift that seems to be emerging even for the empathizers, that to me is the target, that's the battleground, to look at shoring up who are the most likely to respond and the most engaged emotionally, typically.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that's been a consistent story from Worldview over the years as well, that the empathisers are the kind of that middle ground to be won over, and it's really interesting what's emerging from the qualitative work. The other thing I would add to that is to pick up on the Gen Z thing, and we have segments, but then we have other ways of classifying audiences, and I have the amazing pleasure of having a 13-year-old daughter and being on the front line of watching YouTube, TikTok, and everything. And I think you said we need to use the right language. Wow. I could say skibbity. I could say we need to be mindful and demure. But the problem is, I'm not the right person to say that, right? I think I've just proved that. And I think we need to think about messengers as well as audiences. So in some other work we did, one really interesting key trusted messengers was the military, especially amongst those that lean right politically and are a bit older. So if they're the semi-skeptical audience, they trust frontline military engineers, frontline workers, etc., because they seem to be doing something practical and getting on with it. They are seen to be authentic. They're not like a celebrity who's in it for the wrong reasons. Going back to Gen Z, though, I think, online influencers, that is, if that can be done authentically with somebody that has that reach, who, they're not being sent some, skincare products from Sephora, but they're buying into the mission of overseas development and poverty. That could be a real game changer, because then you're getting a new generation that will take that through their lives. But that's a really fine line to walk, and I don't know who knows an online influencer with several million followers, but if you do, that could be a really, really good addition.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions from the floor? No? I have one question just on the polarisation, because actually this year what we're seeing is an increase in slight increase in vocal citizens, increase in the disengaged. So we now kind of have the evidence that it's not just a bit of a feeling, that we're feeling that Ireland is becoming a little bit more polarised, but we're seeing that come through in the research as well. And there's a comment that you made, David, around the the disengaged, we just leave them. So is that, I know this has been something as a sector, you're kind of saying, you put a huge amount of work to try to engage or to try to convert, let's say, the disengaged. Would that, in a time now where we are really up against it, and the trend is going misinformation, disinformation, AI, conspiracy theories, it's all kind of going, and that segment is going to be getting larger. Do you think that we should be kind of trying to convert the empathizers, community champions, the others, and bringing them more on board, and ignoring the disengaged? So I'm curious. I like that from all the panels, actually.
Yeah, okay, I'll go first, because I think it's such a good question. And again, Karen and I were talking just beforehand, and about the importance of being proactive and on the front foot on this question. Because what we saw in Germany was a reaction after the fact that there was this massive shift away from support. So thinking about those people who are currently empathisers but at risk of falling away into the disengaged, and those that maybe are on the disengaged but were empathisers. What is it that they care about? How do they want to hear the issues that you work on being talked about? And for my money, it's very straightforward, kind of old-fashioned, traditional view of what development is around basic needs. That's, we don't all want to be talking about that. I know it feels old, but that is where they are at. So I think that's one thing. Yes, there are parts of the disengaged that you can't reach, but yeah, I probably overstated that a little bit, so thank you for your question. What's the other thing I was going to say? There was one more thing, maybe it'll come back to me. Oh, yeah, strategically. Think about what you want your audiences to do. The engaged audience, do you want them to be doing things, or do you want them just to be unhappy with what you're doing? I'm not going to write angry missives on social media, write to my representative in Parliament demanding things. So there's a sense that actually some people you want to get on board to do things, and then other people you just want their kind of consent to get on and stuff. Thank you.
A bit like our political engagement as well.
Exactly.
I would say that, but yeah, there's sorry.
I think with the disengaged group, it was very clear that they were processing the same information in a slightly different way. They were often returning to what are the issues for Ireland? How does this relate to my needs? What's happening in our country? So some of those rising trends that Katie reported, we were getting in that group. And I think also they had a tendency to be more cynical, more likely to question the veracity. Why are they doing this? Why is that image here? Who is behind this? It was much more typical of their questions. So I agree, I think they tended to migrate to the more traditional types of image that were strong and provocative, but they were also much more cynical and more likely to look for the negative. So we need a much more convincing authenticity message, I guess, in terms of what goes into that target audience, and they're as likely to let it wash off their back as they are to consider it seriously, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree. Honestly, I don't have much to add, but I'd say really looking at as well when we have big important events that is happening, I think it is so important to be part of this dialogue. Let's take, for example, the war now in Gaza. So who led the conversation at the beginning? Who spoke about what happened? Who posted videos? They are actually the Palestinians inside Gaza, and who promoted and helped this message to get across? The Gen Z in general, the TikTok, this generation that they were helping, telling what is happening, because if we don't have that, media was in this war the biggest bias in the world, and I personally find it extremely, extremely disappointing to see how traditional media dealt with what happened. But what we saw is just ordinary people telling what is happening, and people across the world on social media amplifying and promoting more and more of what happened. And probably that's why, in a way, looking at this positive side from younger generation and how we can bring them, when there is big, important human rights events happening.
Great. So any other questions before we wrap up? Gary.
Thanks. Yeah, Gary from Dóchas. Just thinking about. Thanks very much. Just thinking about the rise of AI and the authenticity of images, and how in 5 years' time we don't know where we'll be at, and the challenge of trust in truth and the truth and veracity of our images, and looking at the research in some of the slides, Neil, that you shared, and thinking that one of the variables being the kind of professionalism of the image, and I'm wondering, as the years go by and the challenge of differentiating our images from our sector versus AI images, do we want to maybe lean away from professional, polished images with nice lighting and super sharp focus, etc., towards more of those images that are spontaneous, and some of the eye contact isn't being made in where you can tell that the images are, you just know straight away in your subconscious that these are authentic. So do we need to maybe be playing smart as a sector and going for more of those images, and maybe commissioning less professional photographers and more citizen journalism, or at least selecting some of those images that maybe lean into that credibility and authenticity? So I don't know if any opinions from the panellists.
Sure. I mean, I'll start. I think the issue with AI in many ways is it's a moving target. So the paradigm that we're in now is not the one that we'll be in 2 or 3 years' time, every 6 months' time. How we judge authenticity is in transition. So yes, I think you're right. I think a more candid shot, certainly in this research, tended to connect as not being staged, and it is processed in a way that this is reality, effectively. So there is something in that, but I would see that as a creative direction to whoever it is that's going to be the photographer, rather than choosing citizen photographers exclusively. I think the quality of the image does not preclude it being candid or in the moment necessarily, if the camera person is going out with that in mind. But I think there's also, lastly, if I might add, perhaps slightly mischievously, that this is to a certain extent about storytelling. And how effective the storytelling is at the moment can't be AI because it's not true. I wonder, will that change so that we accept something from AI because it's a good story or it's good entertainment? Because we already have a very porous boundary between real news and entertainment. What I hear on social media is as likely to be something that is entertaining as it is real news. And AI might generate something that is entertaining rather than true, and that might be enough for some people. It's a worrying future, but that's what I'm saying. I think it's a moving target.
Okay, I think, well, I'd like to first of all go to the panelists now just for the last remark. So we are living in challenging times. We have a lot, I think, as a sector to unpack in terms of this research and really start drilling down into how we need to reflect this reality, I think, in our public engagement, communications, imagery, and engagement more broadly with the public. What would be your kind of, I suppose, key recommendation for the sector in terms of what we need to take on board now, what we need to start working on now in order to really, when we're looking down the line, 3 or 4 years into Trump's presidency, into a slightly different world, perhaps or perhaps not, you know, what would you say, you know, your recommendation to the sector in terms of what we really need to pay attention to now, what you saw coming out of the research, and what you'd recommend that, I suppose, we try to work on a bit more solidly collectively? A big question.
I'll start. So, that just come to my mind right now, okay? So, I think authenticity is the biggest thing. Not only in the human rights sector and the charity and NGO, it is across everything. So authentic story, authentic video, authentic photo, with less professional edit, it is getting way more close to the people's heart than high productions. That's what I am seeing right now, even in even YouTube, for example, or a podcast, which will have millions of views. It will involve 2 microphones and probably 1 camera. So that is what the people are heading to. And I think another video I was watching, like content creator on YouTube, he does nothing but just mobile phone, and he speaks for 1 hour, 6 million, 7 million. So, and when you see people, why they are engaging with such content, it is because just authentic, it's himself. There's no edit, there's no polish statements, no lecturing as well, and I think that is an interesting part where I'm seeing that the progress and development of social media and how they are close to heart. And really, I think that is important to have an authentic message in all aspects of it is an important right now. Go back probably a little bit back and just go to yourself.
Okay, thank you. I managed to think of something. You went for authenticity, I'm going to go for a different A, and that's ambiguity, which may sound a bit strange, but I think one of the most interesting things that Neil was walking us through is the notion of layers, and the idea that people can engage with an image, but then they start asking questions. And there's some great research in the US about one of the things that you can help use for people to change their minds is just questioning, right? So you're not directly telling people that they're wrong, which is also important when we're talking about like immigration and housing, right? If that's what people care about, don't tell them they're stupid and that they should care about overseas aid. They've got genuine, treat them with respect, I think. But if we can create images that draw people in and make them ask questions and maybe challenge their assumptions a little bit, then you start to open the door, I think. So that would be my A. So Neil, you need to come up with a third A.
I would say agency. So I think we've seen in the research the importance of generating emotional response. We have a perspective that is perhaps somewhat different from the public that we interview. We've processed this information, we think about it in slightly different ways. They want something that is provoking an emotional response that is probably quite upsetting, but that's not enough. They need to have something to do, and that's agency. So we've seen this in climate change actions, we've seen that in other areas. If we don't give agency to people, then they don't have something to do in response to this. We give them an emotion, but they can end up in sadness, so they can end up in hopelessness, rather than what can I do, how can I contribute? So agency would be my area.
So agency, authenticity, and ambiguity. So they're the three words to remember today. So I'd like to just give a big thanks to our three panelists and indeed to Katie for presenting today. So I think it was a really insightful session and there's a lot we can take from it. And before we finish, I would just like to say a big thank you to Claudia and the whole Dóchas team who have put a huge amount of work into today, and I know who will be engaging with you on this. We have all of this now, it's up on our website, and we'll be working with you not only on the imagery piece, but in terms of what we're seeing in terms of those audiences, how they're shifting here in Ireland, and what we can do about it, what we can, how we can use this research to enable better engagement. So thank you very much for joining this morning, and feel free to ask